This podcast episode is part of the series Listening to Canberra Voices. This episode is recorded on Ngunnawal country and brought to you by the 2023 students of the University of Canberra's Faculty of Arts and Design. I am your host Paris, and today I'll be talking about the experiences of young people in the ACT. For today's episode, our guest is Dr. Justin Barker, the CEO of Youth Coalition. He will share with us his expertise on the structural issues impacting young people in the ACT. Justin is a nationally recognised academic for his research with marginalised communities and young people experiencing homelessness. Justin, welcome to the studio. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
To start us off, can you provide us with an overview of what Youth Co does?
So the Youth Coalition is the peak body for young people and youth affairs. So it's our job to make sure that the government, the community and the community sector are looking after the needs of young people who are under the age of 30. And it's funny, we used to call young people aged 12 to 25, and we've kind of recently extended that based on the research of the social factors, including the cost of living, the difficult transitions to adulthood that are being prolonged, and the longer time people need to stay in university and post-secondary education, to 30.
In your experience, what are the contributing factors that make young people more vulnerable?
That's a great question. Look, young people have much less what a sociologist like me refers to as capital, and in the broadest sense of capital. They have less access to the narrow sense of capital, finances, but they also have less access to social capital, to social networks that they can rely on. It's still the family, and they're building their networks of who else they can rely on. They also don't have what we also think of as cultural capital. They don't have the same kind of track record, work experience, accumulated knowledge that allows them to participate in the labour market like everyone else. So they have less power. So that makes them more vulnerable to everything. So every time there's a crisis, if there's a economic crisis, the first people to be laid off are young people. They just don't have the same power and the same type of capital that adults have available to them.
What are the policy implications of the cost of living crisis and resulting housing insecurity on young people?
I think what happens in policy world and legislation world and funding world of the government is that the government loves to make simple policy decisions and funding decisions with existing policy mechanisms. This is a really boring answer. But so what they normally do is they go, let's do policy X for the whole population group without thinking about the implications of that for subgroups, in this instance, for young people. So for example, if we know that there's a housing crisis, which we have one now, and they go, let's increase the housing stock of public housing and social housing. Now, at first, of course, that's great. The more housing we have on the market, the better. But that housing won't be allocated to young people unless we make it specific to young people. So, yes, it will have a trickle-down effect and could incidentally benefit young people. And yes, the more public and social housing we have, the better everyone. That'll be better for everyone. However, what we find is that 30% of the people who are looking for sustainable housing, for public or social housing, are young people under the age of 25. But we allocate between 6 and 7% to them because the default is to give it to adults first because we think they're going to be able to cope better with it. We think that they've got a better track record of having a house and there's more certainty. And we think, the young person's not going to be able to sustain this housing. Now, there's no proof of that whatsoever. There's this bias that young people aren't going to be able to do it. So the policy implication for that is we need to be mindful of when we have a policy response, such as a housing policy response, we need to go, 30% of the population group are young people under the age of 25 who will miss out on that policy initiative unless we cater it to their needs.
But I guess that's also about listening to them firsthand.
Absolutely. And listening and caring too. I mean, I think they go hand in hand. I think the truth is young people are an afterthought to policy responses. I don't know if it's because they think they don't vote or that they don't have as much impact or in the kind of political world. But you're absolutely right. We don't really listen to the voices of young people, and we might not care as much as a community.
I definitely reckon there's less of an opportunity to have your voice amplified as a young person. So I guess that would also play into it in scenarios where there is that direct impact on this a large majority of young people.
And I think that what happens is older people, of which I'm one, we've all been young people. So we think we know something about it. And we don't realise that the circumstances of being a young person change. The structures and the environment changes. So I was in a meeting a couple of weeks ago with a whole bunch of kind of important people in a room, and this guy in his mid-50s said, "Oh, when I went to uni, they were in a recession. Interest rates were at 17%, and we didn't know if we were going to have jobs, but we just kept on going anyway, and I'm worried that young people aren't as resilient these days." You roll your eyes because you hear this all the time. And I'm sitting there going, yeah, I was at uni then too, buddy. And on Centrelink payments, I paid my rent. I could pay for my food. I had a car. I had beer money. Okay, that's what and I lived in a house, an enormous house with two of my friends all throughout uni. And we didn't at any one point in time think that a house was out of our reach. Jobs were insecure, and we didn't know what jobs were going to look like in 10 years' time. And there wasn't the same kind of environmental and structural crisis. So what he was saying, he's like, it's just part of being a young person. They'll get through it. Why do we need to specifically think about them as a target group so we can justify ignoring them? No, it's different now. Now on Centrelink benefits, you are below the poverty line. You can't pay for your rent. You probably won't even get a private rental property. You definitely can't pay for food. And you're definitely not going to be able to socialise with your friends. So if you're going to cope, you're going to have one or two jobs on top of that. If your university load goes below a certain amount, you'll no longer get Centrelink benefits. So there's all these snowballing implications. And now we have kids, like I have she just turned 16-year-old who already worries about the fact that she's not going to be able to buy a house and is saving money. That didn't happen to me in the 90s. I wasn't saving money for anything because I still had this kind of implicit knowledge that it was all going to roll out before me.
And the prospect of buying a property for university students especially, like we're working as hard as we can whilst studying as much as we can. It's a lot of people are struggling with finding the balance, but you want to get an education, but you've also got to work so much. So
yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's just people talk about the over-engagement of young people right now, that they have to be engaged in way too many things, and the implications of moving one of those pieces impacts the rest. So okay, I'd like to have a social life, but to have a social life and go out with my friends, I'm going to have to earn more money. So I'm going to have to get a part-time job. And I also am going to go to uni as well, make sure I can manage that uni load. Now, if I want to live independently and do those things, I'm going to actually have to work more, which means reducing my university load either formally or just not doing as much, and compromise my education, which then creates even more uncertainty. So we're seeing the implications of housing, quality of life, work, and their social lives are so intertwined, and if you change one of those levers, the rest of them change at the same time. So it creates so much instability and uncertainty in every domain of their life.
The government is currently meeting and discussing new reforms for National Housing Plan. What do you think could be done? What more could be done within the ACT in this space to help youth in this situation?
Yeah. Look, that's another great question. So look, I'm actually part of a group of advocates across Australia who are have been asking the Commonwealth Government to create a child and youth homelessness and housing strategy. So a strategy that specifically looks at how are we going to address the housing insecurity for young people. And they've decided they didn't want to do that. They just want to create a normal one. This kind of gets to my point before. They'll create a policy for the whole population group without necessarily thinking about the specific needs of young people. And we know that young people take up at least 30% of the homelessness population, but we do not allocate that same amount of money and housing to that population group. And this kind of comes back to that point I made before. In the ACT, young people it's harder for them to get on the priority housing list by virtue of being young. The housing stock that we have available isn't being given to young people. I think that we think maybe they can return home or that they can live somewhere else, which is just not the case, especially a lot of people in Canberra, because a lot of people here are students. It's a huge part of what makes up Canberra as our student culture. So the housing strategy really isn't going to be catered for young people's needs unless they purposefully go about doing that. But we really need to think about how do we make incentives for private rental to make sure that young people are seen equally or encouraged to put them in private rental instead of older people? How do we make social and public housing more accessible to them? And again, there are all these disincentives for organisations to do that. Young people don't earn as much money. And even on Centrelink benefits, they get less than adults do. I think the thing that people aren't thinking about is that downstream, this period of instability in young people's lives can have a profound effect. It's like unemployment. Housing instability and unemployment has what we refer to as a scarring effect. It can create a sense of instability that kind of gets really ingrained in you as a person and how you think about and live in the world. You adapt to that insecurity. So I think that one of the things I'd like to talk about is, alongside a cost of living crisis and a housing crisis, we have a mental health and wellbeing crisis for young people. It is at epidemic levels. And we know that all of this structural uncertainty and all of these other things that are happening in young people's lives about cost of living, about housing, about the environment, the uncertainty of employment, my education credential is going to convert to anything that means anything later in life. All of that uncertainty has a huge psychological impact. And it really makes young people have so much uncertainty about their lives now, but their hope for the future. So when we have this kind of pervasive conditions that make young people feel really, really insecure about their lives. And we can't fix the mental health crisis because it's not just about mental health. It's about all these social determinants that we're thinking, it'll kind of sort itself out. But it's not. It's having a huge impact on the lived reality, the day-to-day lives of young people.
And that's the reality for young people in this day and age. And it's scary. It is very scary.
It's really and this kind of comes back to that thing about the adolescent brain. In some ways, young people are incredibly adaptive and creative. They're having to create new identities and ways of being in the world and valuing experience instead of security of housing, to value doing things with their friends instead of buying a car. Because they know that those things are unrealistic. So they're learning to invest in and think of different ways of creating their identity. But at the downside of that is that all of the old landmarks of what it means to be an adult, to be a valued member of society, are not being ticked off. They're not leaving the home at the same age. They're not finishing their degree at the same length of time. Their degree doesn't necessarily convert to a job in the same way with the same degree of certainty. They can't take part in the housing market in the way other people did. And all of those landmarks or ideas of what it means to be an adult are either getting postponed or we're going to have to rethink them.
And do you think that this is being taken seriously, this housing crisis, the impact it has on young people?
Look, as a professional youth advocate, I would say all youth issues aren't being taken seriously. None of them are being taken seriously. It's normally an afterthought because it's not a vote winner. I spend my career trying to convince people, and it's such an annoying thing to say, this is our future. This is a huge part of what contributes to our economy, if that's what you care about the culture of our society. These are 30% of our population, the people coming up with new ideas, doing new and exciting things, the people that will be running our economy and already contributing to it. Why don't you care about them? And I can't figure out why they don't. Young people are an afterthought, and we're not thinking about how can we address their needs? How can we make sure they can have hope for the future? And hope for the future is such an important part of how we act right now. And there's really great psychological research that was saying when you have some idea of where you want to be and you can see that that's vaguely realistic, it makes you invest in today, what you do right now when you wake up, in a very different way than if you feel like you don't know what things are going to be like in the future and you can't see some type of future. But it's really hard to convince a young person, come on, get up and do that thing. And you're like, why? I don't know if it's even going to result in anything, so what's the point? And then we wonder why we've got a mental health crisis.
So I guess it's time for people like adults to reshape their perspective on what it is to be a young person, because it isn't the same anymore, and they have to accept that it is a whole different ball game out there for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it comes back to your point before about not listened to, and even in the microsphere, lecturers at universities more generally, parents and other people in the workforce need to listen to what young people are saying to them about their conditions and take it seriously and not go, oh, come on, stop complaining about that. Stop whinging. It's like, no, they are identifying an actual concern and problem and they're speaking out about it. Actually listen to them and take it seriously and then maybe adapt. So parents need to do this. You can't have the expectations of an 18-year-old being independent today that you did when I was an 18-year-old, because it's not structurally and economically viable for most people. You have to think about it differently. You have to offer a different level of support and continue to nurture that, because they're going to need to rely on those supports. But you also need to respect their independence and their capacity to make life decisions that you're not in charge of. Even in that home environment has a huge impact on people's well-being.
Are there positives or learning curves that you can see coming out of this crisis?
There was a short period of time where we increased people's welfare payments, and to help them address the urgencies and the pressures in their life. And we saw a reduction in domestic and family violence and calls to care and protection and increased family well-being, because suddenly these pressures were eased. The social determinants of their well-being were suddenly eased, and all of a sudden their lives improved. So it's like, okay, so what did we learn from that? Well, apparently nothing, because we've still reduced the Centrelink payments have gone back down to not being adequate. I think we could have learned something from the COVID crisis, that, you know what we need to do for people who are marginalised or people who are struggling to get access to the same amount of supports that we need, which includes young people. Let's improve the access to financial resources for them, or create incentives in the housing market to make sure more young people can get access to housing. Because with that degree of stability and certainty, we'll see every other aspect of their lives become more certain and more definite and having positive impacts. So, but we don't think long-term about these things. We think in election cycles, and we don't really pay attention to evidence either when we're making policies. We think about popular opinion and who's going to vote for us. So I don't think we're particularly learning. I've been doing this job for a long time, trying to convince governments to have child and youth-focused housing strategies and approaches to supporting them, and they seem incredibly resistant. And I'm not quite sure what type of crisis we're going to need to see for people to take it seriously and realise it's different.
That is very powerful. That is very good. Well, thanks again for joining us in the studio today and giving us some of your valuable time. It has been so great to hear your experiences and perspectives on something that is affecting a lot of us here at uni and young people in the ACT. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you.